Hi, I'm Ben, I'm a 1L, and I want to thank Corey for the student fees. This is the Broadband Priority Service Alternative Technology and the Path Toward Universal Access panel. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Weiner, the Senior Fellow at Georgetown University, Michael Santorelli, the Director for Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute, New York Law School, Giulia McHenry, Senior VP Public Policy at AT&T, Jennifer Epperson, the Deputy General Counsel of the North Carolina Governor's Office, David Don, Senior VP Public Policy in Comcast, and a no lesser David Reed, Senior Research Associate here at CU Boulder.
Ben, so I woke up this morning and we figured out I was going to be talking about broadband right early in the morning here, and I am excited to be talking about a very timely topic of interest here. In terms of the framing for this panel, first off, I want to thank Matt Schmidt for putting together this panel and the ideas that are underpinning a lot of it. And we have assembled just an all-star cast here to talk about some very timely and important issues. The current moment in broadband policy reflects really an unprecedented convergence of state and federal deployments of broadband infrastructure, affordability, and adoption initiatives. And most prominently, of course, is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program, but also the Digital Equity Act and Legacy Universal Service Fund high-cost programs. So this convergence raises a deeper question that we'll be investigating in this panel. To what extent can these programs collectively meet the policy goal of Internet for all? And where do the remaining gaps persist? So we're going to be focusing that in our talk today. So we're going to shift gears a bit from yesterday's discussion of the unitary executive theory. I'm not a lawyer, so as the moderator, I'm going to, we have folks who could do that, but we're certainly that's a timely issue of importance here, or AI's growing impact on society. Those were covered very well yesterday. Instead, we're going to be exploring this very important issue of how broadband and the different technology policy issues that are facing our country in the deployment of this Internet for all objectives. So the first question that I have for the panel really is an opening statement, all right? And in doing so, I've asked the panel to, instead of me elaborating further on their bio as an introduction, if you can just, as part of an introduction to yourself, throw out a couple interesting pieces of that, of your past that you think is useful to present and discuss this morning, or share with us this morning, I think is a better way to say that. So what I've asked for the opening statement for the panelists is if they could pick one issue that's characterizing our national in achieving Internet for all, whether it's optimistic or a note of concern, what should be? All right, so this is maybe a takeaway that they want to make sure that they emphasize so that you can get it in your notes right at the beginning of the panel. So I will start with, I'm just going to work my way down. So Jennifer, if you want to.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again to Matt and Silicon Flatirons for the invitation to come speak on one of my favorite issues. Again, my name is Jennifer Epperson. I am the Deputy General Counsel for the North Carolina Governor Stein. But most recently worked in the House of Representatives on the Energy and Commerce Committee, on the Telecom Subcommittee. So I'm kind of in this position where I got to see the formation of BEAD and many other significant broadband laws from that side, and now have shifted to the state side and really involved in taking the football, I suppose, and trying to get a touchdown. I'm going to use too many source metaphors. So maybe just to start off, I would say let's start on an optimistic note, which is that as a country, we are making significant progress toward internet access for all. We saw for a number of years, capital investment, but I think that's where you saw the growing digital divide, even though everyone recognized that it would take infusion of government money to reach some of the areas where capital investment just didn't make it realistic. There was slow and steady programs at the agency level, but it was really, I think, the COVID pandemic highlighted the real need and where those gaps existed. And I think you saw Congress respond with a number of programs that funded broadband expansion through the sort of 2000, 2001. Of course, the end of the 2021 is when the infrastructure bill with the BEAD program passed. So I think during that time, you had slow and steady growth, but then just this real infusion of government funding. And again, because of the need for broadband, you also saw a lot of capital investment in the networks as well. So I think that's a good thing. There are many more houses that are being connected, newer technologies that are being deployed. People are getting faster internet, no doubt about that. I think where we are with BEAD is, I think NTIA states are kind of working toward getting that money deployed. So I think that still leaves a lot of questions, right? I mean, there are things that are, maybe predictable, workforce questions, supply chain questions, potential other sort of disruptions. But it all appears to be sort of going on a track where we'll see, again, just a real expansion of fast, reliable broadband across the country. I think where the biggest questions, though, remain for me, and I think for us on the state level, is, declaring victory on just sort of this internet access pillar isn't going to achieve universal connectivity. I think, there may be a, build it and they will come mentality, and I think that's certainly going to drive some amount of additional, connections. But, I think there are other areas that we can't, stop paying attention to, and, notably affordability and adoption. There's still a real need for policymakers to not take our eyes off the ball and just focus on access. I think you saw in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress tried to set up, funding for all three streams between BEAD, digital equity, and affordable connectivity program. And then even within BEAD, right, there are ways that BEAD itself also addressed all three issues. And, I think there's a recognition that the benefits of, full universal connectivity, won't be achieved without addressing all three of those issues. And so I think it's important to the individuals and communities, but again, kind of as a country driving economic prosperity, it's important to focus across the board. I think that, right now there may be a shift in federal thinking around the importance of some of those issues. And, I think probably what will happen is it will be incumbent on the states that, that kind of share that perspective, hopefully all of them, to prioritize policies, funding, things like that will fill some of those gaps. So, I think the other notable, kind of lesson coming out of the COVID years and headed forward is just a recognition of the incredible capacity that was built at the state level on these issues. So, BEAD helped, BEAD, NTIA, their work kind of implementing the bill helped stand up and make sure that every state had broadband offices, that I think before the bill, there were varying levels of attention paid kind of at a statewide level on this issue. But at this point, you've got state broadband offices across the country. And, I think that significantly benefits, each individual state, but then again, collectively, all of us to have that capacity, that expertise on a state level. And, I would just hope that going forward, that recognition will continue to, well, I'm sorry, that kind of will continue to be recognized, right? And that states really continue to play a leading role here in, again, not just access, but also affordability and adoption. I think, federal funding will be necessary, and I think it'll look different depending on states, and that's just kind of the nature of the country. But I think it will be important for states to continue to kind of play a driver's role on this issue if we're going to kind of achieve universal connectivity.
Right. David.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. It's great to be back at Silicon Flatirons. It's a little dangerous to let me give my own bio here with only 50 minutes for the rest of the panel. But I will say I appreciate being here. I run our policy shop at Comcast. I'm SVP for public policy. My career goes back about 30 years. Listening to the Telecom Act discussion yesterday brought back lots of memories and nightmares of late nights. I'm glad we didn't get into TELRIC pricing. I see Peter there. He probably remembers the exact amount that the amount to. But one thing I do want to point for or highlight for maybe the students and thinking about all this and really the topics of the last days. I was very fortunate to start my career when the Telecom Act was passed. There was a lot of work around that, and it was really the beginning of regulation of commercial mobile wireless services. So I really focused a lot on wireless. I had a mentor at the FCC who was in the movie The Graduate, he said wireless instead of plastics, but he was like, wireless is where you want to be. And I was lucky enough to be able to start my career in wireless. And when I joined Comcast, I was our second hire in the wireless business and doing spectrum policy for Comcast. So that was great. And then as broadband became a very important product for this country, I was able to evolve, being at a company that was the leading broadband provider, and really expand my expertise into broadband regulation. So I've been very fortunate. When we talk here, you could see yesterday all the cutting edge things around AI and where all that's going. So if you're, I think, a law student here, there's a lot to be optimistic about the future. I still, thinking fondly, I guess, of the 96 Act implementation. But let's jump into today's topic. BEAD. I think there are two macro issues we're probably going to explore today, and in my remarks, I maybe want to delve into one of them. We obviously have done a great job of allocating funds. Congress is, getting $42 billion in a few years, getting millions of homes built over the next few years is pretty remarkable. But there are two broad categories I think we've got to looking forward a little bit. One is on the deployment side, right? So we've dealt with the economic barriers to deployment. That's what BEAD was fundamentally about. With $42 billion, we can eliminate or try to address many of the economic barriers that made it uneconomic for private companies to deploy to something like 7 or 8 million homes around the country. Whether you think 42 is the right number or not, plus you add CPF and other monies, we've definitely as a nation dedicated tens of billions of dollars to try to overcome these economic barriers. But now that we've done that and we're in the allocation phase, and in some states like Louisiana, they've already assigned the resources to the winning ISP bidders, we've got to now look at some of the deployment barriers. And these are the non-economic barriers. So the few that I want to explore here for a minute are going to be around permitting, around pole attachments, and access to rights of way. Those are what, now that we've picked the winners, what are they going to do? How are they going to meet their obligations? And how do we continue this state partnership? Because a lot of these issues are state issues and, of course, some federal issues. The other macro issue I think we'll discuss on this panel a little bit is the reserve fund. I know my friend Michael Santorelli was the first on this almost a year ago now. What he realized is between the benefit of the bargain and organic build out by ISPs, a fair number of these unserved homes are going to be built for a lot less. We know, and now we're talking about, and I think Michael was the first to say it, there's going to be about a $20 billion BEAD surplus. So how we spend that wisely is something I think looking forward, this panel we can discuss a little bit about, and all of us should be worried about or thinking about or getting ahead of. So let me just spend a minute or two on these economic barriers to deployment. First of all, permitting reform. Everyone all of these issues are well documented, but I'm not sure we have a lot of resolution. Interestingly, when you do the research, you see some states have started to address these, and hopefully they can be models for other states. But on permitting, we cannot take 12 months to get permits done when you have only 2 years to build out these thousands of homes. And in a lot of areas, they don't have either the resources or the structures, the support to review all the permits. They don't have the processes in place. And we're gonna need our local and state governments to really drive that. I don't think, there are federal permitting issues, but I'm really talking about local and state permitting issues. Obviously, the federal ones are important too, and NTIA is talking about them. But we really need to be talking about what are broadband-ready communities, and do they have the resources and the procedures in place to process permits? So we've got to get on that, because I don't think they do in many locations. Some states do. The next one are pole attachments. We have roughly 180 million poles in this country, and estimates vary as to how many of them need maintenance or replacement. But if you just think 10%, you're talking about 18 million poles. You know, I read one estimate by Google Fiber that they're thinking they've needed to address about 50% of the poles when they've been trying to get on poles and doing make ready. So that's a very big challenge. It still isn't clear necessarily who's responsible for the costs. So we've got to address the cost issues. The states can provide clarity on that. West Virginia recently provided important clarity on who's responsible if a pole needs to be replaced, and you have 5 ISPs on that pole, and you have an electric utility on that pole. Who's paying for that? And some utilities want to say, well, the last attacher has to pay to replace the entire pole cost. Seems a little unreasonable to me, but the bottom line is we need to have some structures here. And if you look, some states are doing this, some aren't. That's going to lead to huge delays in meeting these commitments. And we do have this firm 2030 deadline to try to get done. And then the third one, which is a more recent phenomenon, at least to us in the cable industry, are these rights-of-way accesses. The cable industry traditionally enters the right-of-way through a franchise agreement. These are public rights-of-way, and we've built broadband across this nation using the public rights-of-way. But if you think about who are the unserved, these are more rural, remote areas, and it's more about accessing private rights-of-way, right? What we call easements. And there's a history of utilities getting access to private rights-of-way through state law. They can do condemnation and all kinds of ways to get access to these private rights-of-ways that don't apply to telecom providers or communications providers or cable companies. So that when we see poles there, they're on these private rights-of-way, and we try to gain access, the pole owners sometimes decline to grant access because they'll say it's not permitted under their easement, or they use that as an excuse, or they can't even find the original easement agreement that might have been signed 50, 60, 70 years ago. So we've got all kinds of challenges to get access to these more remote areas, which are less in public rights-of-way. And we're going to need the state governments to really step up and clarify the rights of these ISPs to gain access to these utility poles. So I think I want to focus in a little bit on these non-economic barriers, and we know BEAD is focused on the economic barriers, but if we really are, what our ultimate goal, of course, is to get broadband everywhere. And we've got this narrow window where we have the resources, we have the federal government, we have state organizations that are focused on this. And in a few months, hopefully all the states will have their funds, all the monies will be allocated, and then we've got to pivot from BOB to deployment issues. So okay, that's what we're talking about.
Stephanie.
Thank you. And this is my first Silicon Flatiron, so I'm really excited to be here. Little bucket list for a regulatory lawyer. Now I'm here. It's very exciting. For my bio, I too have been in this space for a long time. I've been in private practice. I was in-house at a data and analytics company. But I've also served as a legal advisor in 3 different federal agencies. In the Counsel's office at the Department of Energy, in the GC's office at the Federal Communications Commission, and most recently, I was chief counsel at NTIA until the beginning of 2025. And I think, you know, this is a great lead-in because I really agree with a lot of what both Jennifer and David had said. Because from where I sit right now, thinking about the BEAD program specifically, we're going to talk about some of the other policies and programs, but for BEAD, I think for where we are right now, the moment of truth for BEAD is not really about policy at this point. It's about performance. It's about these deployment issues and these implementation issues. And whether we achieve internet for all, at least in this access prong, is going to depend upon how BEAD actually gets implemented. Now, I remain cautiously optimistic, right? It's been a long journey for BEAD, but states are moving forward. States are getting their funds. There may be some pathways for the non-deployment funds. The program has changed a lot over the past year, and in meaningful ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about a number of them on the panel. But from where I sit, what has not changed, and what I think and I hope everybody can agree on, is this, and that's the need to make sure that the promise of BEAD actually turns into performance, right? That the networks do get built or capacity gets reserved, that service gets provided, and most importantly, that the homes and small businesses across the country actually get brought online, because that's truly the goal of the BEAD program. And that's where the caution comes in, because unfortunately, as a country, we don't have a great track record on these big infrastructure programs. And this is the biggest one we've seen so far, right? We've seen significant defaults under RDOF. We may talk about that a little bit later in the panel. And Professor Tejas Naranchania, who was on panels in the debate yesterday, but just a call out to him, he and some colleagues did some great research on the Connect America Fund program, looking historically. And there too, we see recipients of those funds didn't necessarily convert or perform in ways that connected houses or didn't connect them at the speeds that were promised when we look at it today. Those weren't failures of policy necessarily or failures of ambition, right? They were failures of implementation. And so I think at this point, as we turn to BEAD, the central question is not whether the goals are right, and in some ways, whether the policies are right. It's whether we can build implementation that's designed to support performance at scale, and at a scale unlike what we have seen before, where we haven't been successful. So what do we do, right? This means focusing now to build in kind of compliance monitoring tools that will support this kind of performance, building it in now, not after the fact when problems arise. To take a minute, grant programs operate, which I learned when I went from the FCC world to the NTIA world, grant programs operate different from regulatory programs, right? They're much more like contracts, terms and conditions that get negotiated. But fundamentally, compliance is still critical, not just for protecting public funds and fiscal integrity, but also making sure that these programs actually achieve the goals that were intended. When I was at NTIA, I spent a lot of time thinking about exactly these kinds of implementation issues. Many people, especially here, it seems like, have probably heard the phrase privacy by design, right? When you're building a product or service, you think about privacy at the beginning. So it's really built into the DNA of a new offering. So my approach at NTIA in my office, and there are actually some alums in my office in the audience. So what we focused on was compliance by design, right? Let's build programs with smarter systems from the beginning that make compliance, a necessary part of the program, but not, we tried wherever we could to streamline those compliance burdens, right? So can we make compliance something that happens, but almost the path of least resistance, right? Brett Frischman yesterday talked about pro-social friction by design. This is a micro example of that, right? Because we needed to make sure the programs were built and designed correctly. We didn't want to slow them up. We can talk about that later too. And while BEAD policy has evolved, some of these are still embedded in the program. One I want to talk about speaks to some of the environmental and permitting concerns that David was referencing, and that's the NTIA's ESAP tool, which was an idea sparked while I was at NTIA, but has really come to fruition. This is a Salesforce-based tool that drives environmental compliance. NTIA made the decision to make states joint lead agencies, sorry, Jennifer, for purposes of NEPA review, for environmental review. It's a big job, and it was one that needed to be decentralized. But we also, or NTIA also built a system that was as user-friendly as possible so that it really broke down the NEPA review process, right? How do you do intake? It was user-friendly. How do you apply a categorical exclusion, which streamlines environmental review? Where you need to go further, which program comments, other kinds of streamlining of these environmental reviews can be triggered and how. It also tracks documentation. It creates a transparency, so it tracks timelines so that everybody can see when things have gone on too long or longer than they should have. And it allows for more efficient NTIA review and approval, right? And so it does two things. It makes sure that everybody complies with NEPA, because that's the law, but it tries to do so in a way that is as easy as possible, minimizing burdens wherever possible to get to the outcome that we want. A project that's built that's compliant with the rules and laws that apply to it. So at this point, and Jennifer called it, I'm not a sports person, but this is a handoff moment. The compliance by design, this idea is really turning to the states and territories, and right now they're negotiating the terms of their awards with their selected subgrantees. And some of these, like the leaked terms and conditions with regard to Starlink, gotten a lot of attention. We might talk about that a little bit too. But no one should really be surprised, right? This is the nature of a grant program. And there are these negotiations that happen with regard to terms and conditions, and particularly where there are different kinds of grant agreements in place. And I think from where I sit, the critical question here is whether states are building in the terms, tools, systems to incentivize streamlined compliance upfront, right, at the outset, and that will empower them to take action, hopefully early to course correct, but if necessary to remedy any noncompliance that does occur. There's no single approach here. It's not an easy task, but there are some tools that I wanted to call out. One tool here, which is you have to be clear milestones for receiving funds, right? Milestones that are tied to performance that can be documented in some real way so that there can be some accountability and some defense of how those funds are spent. Two are risk monitoring frameworks that, this is an approach that allows you to evaluate and intervene early to course correct, because everyone is invested in the project becoming successful. And so if any issues that arise, often outside the provider's control, right? Things related to pole attachment, things that are related to workforce, right? Like how can that be communicated early so there can be a path forward to still accomplishing the deployment that's been promised? And in my view, remedies put in place now so that if necessary, there is an ability to respond to delays or when and if they happen, defaults in ways that allow the program to actually achieve its goal of connecting these whole households and bringing them online. So it's a pivotal moment. Yet again, lots of pivotal moments in this long BEAD journey. But if we don't design this stage of the program correctly, we risk repeating the failures that we've seen in RDOF and CAF. And so, I'll just end where I began. I think this is a moment not so much about policy in the BEAD space, but really about implementation, and whether Internet for All becomes a reality here will really, in my view, depend on whether we implement the program correctly and we treat it as a core feature of design and not just an afterthought for when things go wrong.
Thank you. Michael.
Sure. Well, good morning. Thank you to Silicon Flatirons and Matt for inviting me back. I was here last year for the first time, so it's my second time. Hopefully, I don't overstay my welcome. So I am the director of the Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute at New York Law School. We're an academic program at the school that focuses on all things broadband policy. Someone mentioned yesterday that net neutrality is the issue that keeps on giving. I think BEAD has been the issue that keeps on giving in recent years, and so we've been tracking a lot of what's been happening with BEAD. In terms of my background, I've been at the ACLP almost since it was founded 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years in May. I started my career at the New York City Council in the great city of the People's Republic of New York City, as it's now called, working on tech and telecom policy issues and a lot of my work there was, and this is back in 2005, 2006, was trying to educate city council members about what broadband is and trying to tell them or show them how it was important. I think we're still having some of those conversations across the country, trying to show people why this is an important issue. In terms of my big takeaway for this notion of internet for all, I think it's still a work in progress. On the supply side, getting connections out there. I'll put some numbers around what's already been talked about. So even before $1 of BEAD is put in the ground, so to speak, the digital divide is already closed by 65% since December of 2022 when BEAD was announced. So that's remarkable progress based in large part from continued investment by ISPs, but also an injection of other funds from other programs like CPF and ARPA as well. BEAD will bring connections to about 3.9 million additional unserved locations. And as Corey mentioned in his great keynote, we've seen continued innovation and intense intermodal competition thrive. Prices have, according to our analyses, have barely grown in real terms over the last decade. So a really great position there. But there's some caveats. So based on some of our analysis comparing state BEAD proposals with FCC mapping, we might talk about some of the mapping issues. BEAD could potentially not cover, our latest analysis was 1.2 million locations could be left out of BEAD. At the same time, like the gains we've made in closing the digital divide since December 2022, some of those are just still theoretical, called enforceable commitments. People who would have received capital project funding grants from states have committed to building out these new networks by the end of substantial completion by the end of this year. And so for some of the larger ISPs, that is probably well on its way, but CPF funds went to a lot of smaller ISPs, municipalities too, and some of those could flame out over the next year. I know in New York, for example, they just pulled back a $26 million grant to a project that would cover several thousand locations in rural New York. So it's unclear what happens to those locations once they come off the enforceable commitment list. So then it's too late for BEAD. So they will go into that new bucket of locations that are left. And then, as we might talk about, defaults in the BEAD process going forward are probably likely as well. The focus on lowest cost wins during benefit of the bargain may have put pressure on a lot of the smaller ISPs that are angling for dollars to drive down their prices, their proposals maybe too far. And so once they sign the papers and then they have to actually build the networks, they might say, okay, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. And so there will probably be defaults. And thinking about BEAD in general, in all these grant programs, generally, it is essentially, you're taking a bet on who you're investing in with these dollars. Arguably, the larger ISPs that are getting funding to build out, to extend their existing networks, have the great track record of doing so. But then when you look at the long tail of entities that are scheduled to receive BEAD funds, some of that we have an analysis coming out this week that looks at just the extent to which some of these smaller ISPs are maybe doubling or tripling their existing service territory. And there's a good amount of several dozen small ISPs that are that once they get BEAD funding and their commitments to build, their relative to their current service footprint, their BEAD commitments are several multiples larger than where they're currently serving. And so that's a lot of pressure on a very small ISP to scale their network by 10 or 20, 50, 100 times. That doomed some RDOF recipients as well. So that bears watching. One idea we had for solving this, and as David mentioned, was this notion of a BEAD reserve fund, which is essentially taking some of the leftover funding of the $21 billion in leftover funding, waiting a little bit to let all this shake out and see how many locations are still unserved, maybe at the end of next year or whenever, and then, excuse me, and then running a second round of BEAD to make sure that they're covered and included to get to this notion of internet for all. And then quickly on the demand side, on the supply side, we're talking about the very edges of getting to 100% availability. I don't know if we'll ever get to 100% availability for any number of reasons, but we're getting close, and getting that last edge has always been, everyone I think knew is always going to be very expensive and very complex. On the demand side, there's a lot more work to be done, and I've said for many years and focused on this in a lot of our work that there's just never been a true commitment to this issue at every level of government. The Digital Equity Act was a good start. It forced everyone to plan, but the money that was on offer, $2 billion, was paltry and would have just been a very small down payment on what's actually needed. These are very complex, hyper-local issues that need to be solved, connecting people, showing people the relevance of broadband, and delivering to them the training needed to get online. And it's never been an issue that's resonated with policymakers because it is messy and expensive, and that's something that you can take credit for quickly because it does take a long time to move the needle. And it's not just about affordability. Affordability on its own won't solve the issue. We've seen in the past you can give broadband away for free, as it was for several years in the aftermath of COVID with the ACP and the low-income offerings from so many ISPs, and the broadband adoption rate only ticked up 1 or 2%, or 3%, I think is one of the studies I saw. So a lot more is needed on the ground to make up that gap between availability, which is great, and the number of people who, for whatever reason, don't see broadband as useful or relevant to their lives still. I have lots of ideas on that front, but I'll stop there.
Giulia.
Hi. It's not, okay. Hi, I'm Giulia McHenry. I lead the policy team at AT&T, so I'm like David's counterpart at AT&T. Before I get started, I want to say thank you to Silicon Flatirons for having me, and also a special shout out to Matt. This is his first conference as head, and I think you're putting your brand on it, and I really appreciate how much you've worked with us and all the speakers in terms of molding this into something that really is balanced, and hearing all the voices from DC to academia and the states, and really forcing us all a little bit out of our shells. So thank you and nice job. So my background, I was actually trying to get into college in 1996. And I remember the Telecom Act because suddenly it became a lot cheaper to call my boyfriend in college at the time. My background, I am a PhD economist. I came out of school and started working at a consulting firm, and actually kind of got into telecom because my background was in auction theory. And that lends itself nicely to matching models, which are inherently helpful for all aspects of telecom. And so then I decided I want to kind of understand the real makings of policy a little bit more, and I ended up as chief economist at NTIA, which was a great opportunity to really understand all the aspects of everything NTIA does, including spectrum, and it wasn't BEAD yet, but a lot of sort of broadband grant programs and even FirstNet and everything in between. So that was really exciting. And then I went over to the FCC and stood up and led for 6 years the Office of Economics and Analytics. So I have firsthand experience with many aspects of the design and implementation of RDOF. So I know where all the bodies are buried on that one. And also I was chief of of OEA while we were standing up the BDC, which is the broadband data collection. So I am very passionate about that. So hopefully I will keep the rest of my remarks short, and that will lead us some time to talk about those things. But so kind of building off everything that was said here, and particularly really talking about kind of reiterating some of what Michael said. I think we are, frankly, in the golden age of broadband. I don't think we have seen as many technologies and the quality and speed of those technologies as we currently have. I think consumers have an incredible number of options that we did not anticipate 10 years ago, right? We have mobile, we have fiber, we have cable, we have satellite, we have fixed wireless, and you see convergence. And this is something that Corey talked about, Don talked about, that David talked about. But essentially, right, AT&T, for example, has really a converged set of options. We have a mobile network. We can touch over 30 million homes with fiber, locations with fiber. We have over 2 million fixed wireless customers, and we are growing and committed to growing that further, growing our fiber network further by 2030. So, and we're all talking about convergence, right? Now cable companies are offering mobile services. We are offering combinations of wireless, fixed wireless, fiber, bringing in satellite to supplement. And then, of course, we also have Starlink and all the other alternatives for satellite. So we are truly at this moment that allows so many consumers to have so many options. And I think, as Michael alluded to, you've seen a real closing of the digital divide since 2022, even before we get those BEAD dollars out, right? So this is a great moment across the board. So I want to recognize that. But obviously, this doesn't close the gap, right? So BEAD is an incredibly important program to see what else we can do, how much further we can build into all areas. And obviously, we are very excited to take part in it and implement our piece of it, and are kind of also looking at, as this moves forward, how can we continue to close some of those gaps that might not end up getting filled because of defaults or the like. So I think there's a huge amount that can be done there, but also, there will still be, as Michael said, at least 1.2 million locations that will still not be covered by the end of this. And that is really the long tail. And I think looking beyond BEAD, we've tried the RDOF auction approach. We've tried the BEAD approach. We need to start thinking about what is the infrastructure program that truly gets us to close that gap. And I suppose also if we actually need it, right, with all of these various technologies. But I think while we're focused on implementing BEAD, I think we should also start thinking about what does get us to 100%, of households covered. And how do you start thinking about what the design is for a program that really has to touch really some idiosyncratic long tails that maybe we're not getting to. So with that, I think I will turn it back over.
All right. Thank you, Giulia. And thank you for the panel. All right. So we're going to now transition to a set of questions, a little bit more lightning format here now. All right. So we're going to, I want to start first and talk about, the convergence with wireless, but that is more immediate with satellite, and how satellite has become a part of BEAD. And there were a couple recent events here that I want to throw in as context for the panel and for the audience. The first was an article that came out about a letter that was from SpaceX to the state broadband offices that with the headline was that SpaceX was requesting exemptions from certain BEAD requirements. It's not a public letter, so whether that's an accurate characterization, there was certainly some type of a negotiation going on there between the state broadband offices and SpaceX about being able to meet the requirements of BEAD. And another recent event is that SpaceX was approved in early January to add 7,500 Gen 2 Starlink satellites to orbit, so doubling its capacity up to 15,000 satellites across a lot of different frequency bands, but expanding the LEO constellation there. And finally, just on Friday, they've been busy with an announcement of up to 1 million more satellites for a broadband data center. So maybe that's not core to BEAD, but certainly part of that emerging constellation. So my question really is, what is, from your perspective, the impact of these types of requests on the BEAD program? And, what does it mean is we go forward, is satellite an important part of at least the rural coverage and for meeting these important targets? So somebody, Stephanie, can you jump in quick? Because we had talked a little bit about,
Sure.
Some of this.
Sure,
And-
thanks. Look, I think the low Earth orbit satellites it's an amazing technology. And I think it's disruptive, but in a lot of great ways, right? It's disruptive competition-wise to bring choices, as Giulia talked about. It's just disruptive in how we think about policy in this space. For a long time, latency was really a big problem, or from my perspective, a concern with a lot of satellite technologies, and that's really not the case with low Earth orbit. And so it really kind of leads to, I think, a lot of creative and new thinking, both, I'm sure, for the businesses here at the table, but also for the policymakers about how do we integrate that into the suite of solutions. With regard to BEAD, like I think it's, and I'm glad I get the opportunity to say this. I know there's a lot of talk about technical neutrality, right, with BEAD, and that was, of course, one of the big changes with the restructuring of the BEAD program. But what that really was about the selection, a neutral selection of the subgrantee, right? And so the NTIA removed what was a clear fiber preference, and there was now a competition that was neutral with regard to technologies. In my view, that doesn't mean that the program can or really should ignore the technical realities that are different in the different technologies. And with regard to low Earth orbit satellites, you see that in a lot of different ways. And I mean, one of them, I'll just call it out, right? NTIA did something interesting when it made this change, in that locations that could be served by satellite were not counted as served and remain eligible for the BEAD program, but the service of low Earth orbit satellite was eligible for funding so long as there was sufficient capacity, right? So the way that it reconciled those two things, that locations served by satellite are not yet served but could receive funds to be served, was the creation of a different kind of grant agreement, right? And so it is not agreement for infrastructure build. It is agreement for the reservation of capacity. I don't think that means it didn't surprise me, honestly, that there was a back and forth. I'm sure it wasn't great that it became public, but that there was a back and forth over what that grant agreement should look like and what those terms should be that would work for both Starlink or Amazon LEO to perform the obligations it had, but also what the state needs in order to make sure that there's fiscal responsibility and accountability and documentation, some of those things that I talked about in my opening. And so, I mean, for this piece of it and the recent leak, I think that's what's really going on here. How do we balance making sure that the program's actually successful, that it can deliver, but it can deliver in a way that is, monitored, that there's an understanding of what it means to document capacity, and either that's the internal workings of the system or that is some other measure, because otherwise, there's just not going to be the same kind of accountability as there are in the grant agreements that are for deployment.
Right.
I'll stop, sorry.
So Giulia, is this kind of an early example of some of the convergence you're talking about with wireline, wireless, and trying to fill in?
I mean, so I heard your question in two parts, and so
Yeah.
I think certainly satellite is a fundamental and important component to how we're going to close the digital divide, and is important, for rural areas and even areas that may, for whatever reason, not be connected. My brother-in-law lives in a very densely populated area, but just happens to literally be on the wrong side of a railroad track, and they can't get under the railroad track. And so he's got copper that's been there since before the railroad, and Starlink, right? So this is certainly part of the solution. And I think it's an important part of the solution. I think with respect to the sort of the BEAD and the BEAD negotiations, I will just say we as a bidder spent a huge amount of time upfront and then revising everything we had already done, focused on what we could reasonably serve, making offers that were responsible, that we know we could meet, and ensuring that when we were meeting those, we were doing it in a way that we were meeting all of the requirements that NTIA was putting on us at the time. And so I think, from our perspective, maybe those are the negotiations. I think in terms of administering a program like that, those are the types of things that ideally get worked out before bids are submitted. So I think that is, that's just one piece. And it kind of gets to, how are we ensuring that all of the bidders who are responsibly bidding and bidding in a way that they know that they can deploy.
Okay, I'm going to jump now to another important topic here that I want to make sure we cover is that, so the benefit of the bargain basically has saved an estimated $21 billion. It's a different methodology in terms of cost efficiency. The question really is, given, and some of you have touched on this, but with the RDOF and the defaults there, if we can look forward, are there some useful lessons learned for BEAD that address any concerns that this methodology might have placed on the budgets that have been actually realized through the benefit of the bargain?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from RDOF. We know, if you look at Michael's work, there's going to be at least 1 million homes left unserved even after this round of BOB is done. And so, but we're fortunate, right? We right now look like we're going to have a $20 billion reserve. I think this is the next big question. What are we going to do with that reserve? And I think one of them is we cannot consider BEAD done if we know there's going to be 1 million homes unserved without your defaults, without any organic growth in home construction over the next 5 years, which there will be. So I think, and we know there will be defaults. I think in the RDOF, we're estimating, I think it's about 1/3 of them have defaulted. The programs are very different, so I don't know if you can really extrapolate that high. I don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that, but we know there'll be some defaults, and they'll be unable to claw back some of those funds from those defaulters, just depending on where they are in the process. So we have to, I think the answer is we set aside most, if not all of that $20 billion. We hold it, we don't start spending it on alternatives or on other ideas until we know we've reached the deployment goal, which is 100% of broadband availability to every home in America. So we should anticipate defaults. We should anticipate organic growth. We already know, because of when the map was frozen, that there's going to be homes that are unserved, even as the rules stand now. So I think that's all going to happen. But luckily, we have resources here that we couldn't have fathomed having, even 3 years ago.
Somebody else want to?
No, I think, as an economist, you think when you're administering any of these programs, there is a balance, right, between and this is true of like any auction or matching, any sort of matching moment in a transaction, right? There is a balance between the quality and the extent to which you're prioritizing quality and the bargain. And where you fall in that balance will impact the number of defaults you have, right? The extent to which something is going to get done well but expensive, and the extent to which things are going to slip. So I agree with David, we need to think about how we're going to hold some of that money in reserve. But I think it'll be interesting to see as this plays out whether we've hit the right mark.
So is there any process that can be addressed with that, or is that just, I mean, how do you take the next step? I mean, it's constrained by legislation, right? But
Yeah,
how
so
do you
I was
move
just
forward?
gonna just put out there, well, first of all, on the question of defaults, I'm really concerned, you could tell, because that's what I spent on my whole opening on. And I think that, totally separating out the views on the policy choice, I think it's clear that Bob and then the additional benchmark round really put pressure on cost to deploy and did not allow states to look in the same ways at things beyond cost. I mean, it's really more regressive than RDOF, which allowed for weights for different performance. So all that means is that there's, I think, a real risk here. The concept of a reserve fund, I love. I just am not sure, given the statute's reference to a final list in terms of making the awards, how to reconcile that. And it's not that I don't think, I can't say whether it could be done, right, with, because I think it's a critical step to actually completing the goal of BEAD. It may not be BEAD, it may be the next thing, or may require a tweak, whether that can be done by guidance or would need legislation.
For everybody, is there any early indicators out there? State broadband offices, do you get a heads up maybe, or
Well, maybe I'll just jump in and say I have been hesitating calling them non-deployment funds, but rather unspent allocated funds, right? Because I think as a state, we see our total allocation and are thinking about the best ways to use that. We recognize that in the most recent FCC map, there are additional unserved and underserved locations that were, part of our BEAD bid. And so I think one thing, the governor sent a letter to Secretary of Commerce and Assistant Secretary Roth and suggested that this is appropriate use of funds to take another look at where we are now versus when the plans were written. So I don't think that they're necessarily non-deployment funds. They could still be deployment funds. And so I think there may be ways working within the statutory construction to think about using the funds. But, as I said, we're also thinking a lot about adoption and affordability and how some of these funds could go toward the goal of universal service. But I think it's completely fair. This was a huge, generational investment by Congress, and we don't expect that there will be, another big infusion of cash the same way this one was. In terms of it, I think indicators, North Carolina has devoted almost $1 billion from ARPA, like that's capital projects, but also the state and local funds toward broadband deployment since 2021. So we are seeing right now, right, there's a lot of lessons learned. I mean, it's again a huge amount of money. So we are using that process, lessons learned, very close. Our broadband office has employees that are, develop that on the ground relationship with our providers, and they are checking in with them frequently and making sure they understand any barriers that they're facing. And we're talking about that at a state level to see what we can do also to address polls, to address other permitting issues, and recognizing those. So in my opinion, some of this is also just having state folks and community folks who are important here, understanding the on the ground realities and not just reading reports as they come in, the reporting that's required and, will be required for BEAD, but also like having a real understanding of the dynamics that are taking place in, across the state.
Literally be the boots on the ground.
That's right.
Which you didn't have an RDOF or somebody, right? With
That's right,
federal
exactly.
agencies.
That's
so
right.
That is a good point. All right, let's jump to the accountability question. Again, Stephanie, you raised this somewhat of compliance by design, but the BEAD does include a prescriptive federal broadband performance testing regime. And for those of you who don't know, that's it requires performance tests that are done on the deployed infrastructure during kind of peak hours, 6 p.m. to midnight. So you have to have 80% percentile requirement for the 100/20 megabits per second. So you have to make sure 80% of the tests meet the 100 megabit down and 20 megabit up requirement for speed. Latency has to be the 95th percentile at 100 milliseconds, and reliability is 48 hours over a 365-day period, which is basically a, annual uptime of about 99.45%. So the question here is, is this enough? Is there sufficient emphasis on the post-deployment accountability for this to make sure that that we're getting what we paid for with these federal subsidy dollars?
I'll just say two quick things here. One is, the NTI's approach to performance measurement largely tracked the FCC's approach to performance measurement. And I think that made a ton of sense, right? Like there are broadband providers who are engaged across both agencies, involved in universal service programs, involved in other kinds of programs, as well as the BEAD program, right? Again, like, yes, you want compliance, but let's create a compliance regime that's as streamlined and easy as possible, right? And so it's apples to apples. I think there are going to be, because of BEAD, we're going to end up with a lot more data on performance, because the recipients do need to, my understanding is, provide not just a certification, but their test results, and that unclear the extent and how it will, whether and how it will be public. I think transparency in a way that's competitively sensitive may be helpful, because for my second point, I'm just a little concerned about the state's capacity. There may be some states that are both sophisticated technically and have a lot of experience with testing. I think Minnesota has been doing broadband testing for a long time. I heard their state broadband officer may not, right? And so I do think it's an issue, but I think it is at least a regime that makes sense, and hopefully data that can be addressed.
Okay, and we have 5 minutes left here for any questions. If somebody wants to get a question here, does anybody want to add on a quick comment?
I'm just going to say the notion of measurement and broadband speed measurement. We've done this a lot of different ways over the last 20 years, and some ways are good and some ways are not accurate. And so obviously getting an accurate way is important, doing it in a streamlined fashion. We should have that down now, at least as speed measurement goes. That's one of the factors you mentioned. That we've got that down pretty good. And some of these other ideas about measuring indirectly usually are not accurate. So I just want to remind folks of that.
A question here.
Hi, everybody. My question is for Jennifer. So I know, because we talked about it at the time, that it was important to Congress that the BEAD money be well spent on actually connecting people and like the administrative costs and efficiencies be achieved. It's, I think, clear now that running these programs requires having really good tools. Some of the tools that Stephanie talked about, maybe reusable tools around things like permitting reform. If we, in an analogous program in the future, should we think differently about administrative costs and the costs of building the systems that should survive the program and be reusable again in the future? Should we fund them differently?
Good.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think, as has been highlighted by Stephanie across the panel, I mean, I do think that sometimes administrative costs, I mean, you don't want to, as and Congress is writing a bill, devote, allow so much administrative costs to eat up, into actually deploying and getting it out. But I think when you think about compliance, when you think about making sure that all of this is actually achieved, I think you have to be thinking about administrative costs and and how we can do it. Our state appropriated the ARPA funds that came in and left a small sliver for administrative costs just of running the broadband office. And I think, you know, the more capacity they're going to have, the more they're going to be able to be the boots on the ground and learning about all this. So some of it's people, but I think investing in the tools that can help, you know, will certainly last beyond this program.
So I'll do a question here. We have time for, I'm told by Matt, one more question if somebody wants to jump in.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about polite fiction that informed the satellite discussion, because I heard two things. I'd like to get your perspective on that. Namely, one is, well, we needed satellite. It's an important thing. But the question that I didn't hear answered, why is Starlink getting roughly $1,500 in many states for doing what they're already doing? I mean, Stephanie and I, we've worked on this topic, is the reserve notion, reserve capacity is engineering-wise polite fiction. It served the NTIA well because they got something, supposedly. It served Starlink well because they could promise something that didn't cost them anything in that. So we're operating on this kind of fiction that now the letter is exposed as basically fiction. And so where Starlink says, well, we're not really reserving it. We can't really do that because satellites fly all over and all that. So I'm curious if Starlink is indeed able to capture that last 1 million locations and that people can subscribe to that service today, why should we subsidize those locations? Why should there be a follow-on program? Why should we just say, well, you're good to go. Maybe we should spend it on affordability because it's only going to be $80 for affordability if you're Starlink, which is not my version of affordability.
So for those who didn't hear, Henny wants to know, why does Elon Musk need another government subsidy? just to be clear.
Yeah, I don't want to answer that question. To Henny's, go ahead.
Do we need a supply side subsidy like we do for wireline, right? Because your point was maybe we need a demand side to help subsidize low income users, or like we had with electric cars, you subsidize the demand side. But if he's already building this network, why do we need to give him more? Why do we need to give him more subsidies for the supply side? It's not clear to me.
I guess what I will say is I think that I don't agree that it is a complete fiction. I do think that there is intended to be a guarantee to try to get to those last hardest to serve households, right? The long tail, some of whom will continue to be left out as we've talked about, right? But in a way that it just, I guess my answer would be, it needs to be done in a way that can document exactly what is being received by the government, by the state, and by those households for that investment. For instance, right, if there is a milestone based on subscription, which was one of the alternatives in NTIA's guidance, right, then you know you are getting something, that there is a consumer and that performance testing, all the other testing can be achieved. It becomes trickier for how to document and create that accountability in the absence of that. And so it is a challenging problem. I think it became more of a, whether you call it a fiction or a challenge, became bigger after the benefit of the bargain reforms, because so much more of the program is going, because of the emphasis on cost to deploy, and therefore so much more of the satellite of funds are going to these reservation of capacity agreements. But that, it just emphasizes my point that those agreements need to be extremely carefully drafted so that there can be accountability for those grant awards. I think it's possible to do it.
Well, I mean, and Giulia, you talked about the long tail. Does satellite solve the long tail?
They do. I mean, yes. And I mean, I really like David's concept of, you know, actually looking at subsidizing satellite, because I do think one of the problems with satellite for rural Americans, who are many of whom are low income, is it's not affordable. You know, that doesn't, my my brother-in-law is not in that category, but I think that is a big problem with satellite. I will also say, I think getting to, so at the FCC, we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we incentivize satellite providers to actually, connect households where they're getting subsidies for them. And I know Evan and Paul have done a huge amount of work on this. And and I think some really important, interesting work, but one of the concerns that came up is that when you're looking at measuring subscribers, that it's like easy to generate subscribers, so it is unfortunately very easy to get around around subscriber-based requirements. So I think this is an area we should keep thinking about what's the right approach. I'm just trying to say, it's anecdotally, it's not as easy to fix and to solve for as you might think in building a program.
Okay, I think Matt last night was talking about the mission for Silicon Flatirons and the purpose to elevate the debate. And I think our panel has done an excellent job at elevating the debate. And as I close here, I want to note, being a former chief strategy officer, and what do? We connect dots. Jennifer with the state capacity and has boots on the ground, and how that's a new arrow in the quiver for funding programs in terms of trying to deliver. David with the non-economic barriers, permitting pole attachments, rights of way, being critical. Stephanie with the performance or the compliance by design. Michael with watch, it still matters. We got to have eyes on key metrics of who's being served. And Giulia with the optimism, but moving forward with the convergence, and that's going to pose new ways to solve problems. I think we've elevated the debate quite well. And if you can join me in thanking the panel, I appreciate it.
Well, thanks again, Professor Reed and panel.